Welcome back to my channel Read With Me. After a long time I am here, this time with a new book which is Dubliners by James Joyce, and this is actually a short story collection. Recently I just have got in my mind that I can give it a read, so I thought why not let's read it with everyone. So I'm here, Dubliners by James Joyce. As it is a collection of short stories, the very first short story here is The Sisters. So let's start. The Sisters. There was no hope for him this time. It was a third stroke. Night after night I had passed the house. It was vacation time, and studied the lighted square of window. And night after night I had found it lighted in the same way, faintly and evenly. If he was dead, I thought I would see the reflection of candles on the darkened blind, for I knew that two candles must be set at the head of a corpse. He had often said to me, I am not long for this world. And I had thought his words idle. Now I knew they were true. Every night as I gazed up at the window, I said softly to myself the word paralysis. It had always sounded strangely in my ears, like the word gnomon in the Euclid and the word simony in the Catechism. But now it sounded to me like the name of some maleficent and sinful being. It filled me with fear, and yet I longed to be nearer to it and to look upon its deadly work. Old Cotter was sitting at the fire, smoking, when I came downstairs to supper. While my aunt was ladling out my stirabout, he said, as if returning to some former remark of his, no, I wouldn't say he was exactly, but there was something queer. There was something uncanny about him. I will tell you my opinion. He began to puff at his pipe, no doubt arranging his opinion in his mind. Tiresome old fool. When we knew him first, he used to be rather interesting, talking of faints and worms, but I soon grew tired of him and his endless stories about the distillery. I have my own theory about it, he said. I think it was one of those peculiar cases, but it is hard to say. He began to puff again at his pipe without giving us his theory. My uncle saw me staring and said to me, well, so your old friend is gone, you will be sorry to hear. Who? Said I. Father Flynn. Is he dead? Mr. Cotter here just told us. He was passing by the house. I knew that. I was under observation, so I continued eating as if the news had not interested me. My uncle explained to old Cotter. The young star and he were great friends. The old chap taught him a great deal, mind you, and they say he had a great wish for him. God have mercy on his soul, said my aunt piously. Old Cotter looked at me for a while. I felt that his little beady black eyes were examining me, but I would not satisfy him by looking up from my plate. He returned to his pipe and finally spat rudely into the grate. I wouldn't like children of mine, he said, to have too much to say to a man like that. How do you mean, Mr. Cotter? Asked my aunt. What I mean is, said old Cotter, it's bad for children. My idea is, let a young lad run about and play with young lads of his own age and not be. Am I right, Jack? That's my principle too, said my uncle. Let him learn to box his corner. That's what I'm always saying to that Rosicrucian here. Take exercise. Why? When I was a nipper, every morning of my life I had a cold bath, winter and summer. And that's what stands to me now. Education is all very fine and large. Mr. Cotter might take a pick of that leg mutton, he added to my aunt. No, no, not for me, said old Cotter. My aunt brought the dish from the safe and put it on the table. But why do you think it's not good for children, Mr. Cotter? She asked. It's bad for children, said old Cotter, because their minds are so impressionable. When children see things like that, it has an effect. I crammed my mouth with stood about for fear I might give utterance to my anger. Tiresome old red-nosed imbecile. It was late when I fell asleep. Though I was angry with old Cutter for alluding to me as a child, I puzzled my head to extract meaning from his unfinished sentences. In the dark of my room, I imagined that I saw again the heavy grey face of the paralytic. I drew the blankets over my head and tried to think of Christmas, but the grey face still followed me. It murmured, and I understood that it desired to confess something. I felt my soul receding into some pleasant and, vicious region. And there again I found it waiting for me. It began to confess to me in a murmuring voice, and I wondered why it smiled continuously and why the lips were so moist with spittle. But then I remembered that it had died of paralysis, and I felt that I too was smiling feebly as if to absolve the simoniac of his sin. The next morning after breakfast, I went down to look at the little house in Great Britain Street. It was an unamusing shop. It was an unassuming shop registered under the vague name of drapery. The drapery consisted mainly of children's bootish and umbrellas, and on ordinary days a notice used to hang in the window saying umbrellas recovered. No notice was visible now, for the shutters were up. A crape bouquet was tied to the door knocker with ribbon. Two poor women and a telegram boy were reading the card pinned on the crepe. I was approached and read. July 1st, 1895, the Rev. James Flynn of S. Catherine's Church, formerly of St. Catherine's Church, Meath Street, age 65 years, RIP. The reading of the card persuaded me that he was dead, and I was disturbed to find myself at check. Had he not been dead, I would have gone into the little dark room behind the shop to find him sitting in his armchair by the fire, nearly smothered in his great coat. Perhaps my aunt would have given me a packet of high toast for him, and this present would have roused him from his stupefied doze. It was always I who emptied the packet into his black snuff box, for his hands trembled too much to allow him to do this without spilling half the stuff about the floor. Even as he raised his large trembling hand to his nose, little clouds of smoke dribbled through his fingers over the front of his coat. It may have been these constant showers of snuff which gave him ancient, precisely garments their green faded look, for the red handkerchief, blackened as it always was, with the snuff stains of a week with which he tried to brush away the fallen grains, was quite inefficacious. I wished to go in and look at him, but I had not the courage to knock. I walked away slowly along the sunny side of the street, reading all the theatrical advertisements in the shop windows as I went. I found it strange that neither I nor the day seemed in a mourning mood, and I felt even annoyed and discovering in myself a sensation of freedom, as if I had been freed from something by his death. I wondered at this, for as my uncle had said the night before, he had taught me a great deal. He had studied in the Irish college in Rome, and he had taught me to pronounce Latin properly. He had told me stories about the catacombs and about Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had explained to me the meaning of different ceremonies of the Mass and of the different vestments worn by the priest. Sometimes he had amused himself by putting difficult questions to me, asking me what one should do in certain circumstances, or whether such and such scenes were mortal or venial or only imperfections. His questions showed me how complex and mysterious were certain institutions of the church which I had always regarded as the simplest acts. The duties of the priest towards the Eucharist and towards the secrecy of the confessional seemed so grave to me that I wondered how anybody had ever found in himself the courage to undertake them. And I was not surprised when he told me that the fathers of the church had written books as thick as the post office directory and as closely printed as the law notices in the newspaper, elucidating all these intricate questions. Often when I thought of this, I could make no answer, or only a very foolish and halting one upon which he used to smile and nod his head twice or thrice. Sometimes he used to put me through the responses of the mass which he had made me learn by heart, and as I pattered, he used to smile pensively and nod his head, now and then pushing huge pinches of snuff up each nostril alternately. When I smiled, he used to uncover his big discolored teeth and let his tongue lie upon his lower lip, a habit which had made me feel uneasy in the beginning of our acquaintance before I knew him well. As I walked along in the sun, I remembered old Clotter's, words, and tried to remember what had happened afterwards in the dream. I remembered that I had noticed long velvet curtains and a swinging lamp of antique fashion. I felt that I had been very far away in some land where the customs were strange in Persia, I thought, but I could not remember the end of the dream. In the evening, my aunt took me with her to visit the house of mourning. It was after sunset, but the window panes of the houses that looked to the west reflected the tawny gold of a great bank of clouds. Nanny received us in the hall, and as it would have been unseemly to have shouted at her, my aunt shook hands with her for all. The old woman pointed upwards interrogatively, and on my aunt's nodding, proceeded to toil up the narrow staircase before us. Her bowed head being scarcely above the level of the banister rail. At the first landing, she stopped and beckoned us forward encouragingly towards the open door of the dead room. My aunt went in, and the old woman, seeing that I hesitated to enter, began to beckon to me again repeatedly with her hand. I went in and tiptoe. The room through the less end of the blind was suffused with dusky golden light, amid which the candles looked like pale thin flames. He had been confined. Nanny gave the lead, and we three knelt down at the foot of the bed. I pretended to pray, but I could not gather my thoughts because the old woman's mutterings distracted me. I noticed how clumsily her skirt was hooked at the back, and how the heels of her cloth boots were trodden down all to one side. The fancy came to me that the old priest was smiling as he lay there in his coffin. But no. When we rose and went up to the head of the bed, I saw that he was not smiling. There he lay, solemn and copious, vested as for the altar, his large hands loosely retaining a chalice. His face was very truculent, grey and massive, with black cavernous nostrils and circled by a scanty white fur. There was a heavy colour in the room, the flowers. We crossed ourselves and come away. In the little room downstairs, we found Eliza seated in his armchair in state. I groped my way towards my usual chair in the corner, while Nanny went to the sideboard and brought out a decanter of sherry and some wine glasses. She set these on the table and invited us to take a little glass of wine. Then, at her sister's bidding, she filled out the sherry into the glasses and passed them to us. She praised me to take some cream crackers also, but I declined because I thought I would make too much noise eating them. She seemed to be somewhat disappointed at my refusal and went over quietly to the sofa where she sat down behind her sister. No one spoke. We all gazed at the empty fireplace. My aunt waited until Eliza sighed and then said, "Ah, well, he has gone to a better world." Eliza sighed again and bowed her head in assent. My aunt fingered the stem of her wine glass before sipping a little. "Did he peacefully?" she asked. "Oh, quite peacefully, ma'am," said Eliza. "You couldn't tell when the breath went out of him. He had a beautiful death, God be praised, and everything. Father O'Rourke was in with him a Tuesday and, anointed him and prepared him and all. He knew then? He was quite resigned." "He looks quite resigned," said my aunt. "That's what the woman we had in to wash him said. She said he just looked as if he was asleep. He looked that peaceful and resigned. No one could think he had made, he would make such a beautiful corpse." "Yes, indeed," said my aunt. She sipped a little more from her glass and said, "Well, Miss Flynn, at any rate, it must be a great comfort for you to know that you did all you could for him. You were both very kind to him, I must say." Eliza smoothed her dress over her knees. "Ah, poor James," she said. "God knows we done all we could. As poor as we are, we wouldn't see him want anything while he was in it." Nanny had leaned her head against the sofa pillow and seemed about to fall asleep. "There is poor Nanny," said Eliza, looking at her. She is wore out. Like all the work we had, she and me, getting in the woman to wash him and then laying him out and then the coffin and then arranging about the mass in the chapel, only for Father Oroke. I don't know what we had done at all. We had done at all. It was him brought us all them flowers and them two, candlesticks out of the chapel and wrote out the notice for the Freeman's General and took charge of all the papers for the cemetery and poor James's insurance. Wasn't that good of him?" said my aunt. Eliza closed her eyes and shook her head slowly. "Ah, there is no friends like the old friends," she said, "when all is said and done. No friends that a body can trust." "Indeed, that's true," said my aunt, "and I'm sure now that he is gone to his eternal reward, he wouldn't forget you and all your kindness to him." "Ah, poor James," said Elijah. "He was no great trouble to us. You wouldn't hear him in the house any more than now. Still, I know he is gone, and all to that. It's when it's all over that you will miss him," said my aunt. I know that," said Eliza. "I wouldn't be bringing him in his cup of beef tea any me. Nor you, ma'am, sending him his snuff. Ah, poor James." She stopped as if we were communing with the past and then said shrewdly, "Mind you, I noticed there was something queer coming over him latterly. Whenever I had bring in his Whenever I bring in his soup to him, there I had find him with his breviary fallen to the floor, lying back in the chair and his mouth open." She set a finger against her nose and formed. Then she continued, "But still and all he kept on saying that before the summer was over he had go out for a drive one fine day, just to see the old house again where we were all born down in Irish Town and take me and Nanny with him. If we could only get one of them new-fangled carriages that makes no noise that Father Oroke told him about, like them with the rheumatic wheels for the day cheap," he said, "at Johnny Russell's over the way there and drive out the three of us together of a Sunday evening. He had his mind set on that. Poor James." "The Lord have mercy on his soul," said my aunt. Eliza took her Eliza took out her handkerchief and wiped her eyes with it. Then she put it back again in her pocket and gazed into the empty gate for some time without speaking. He was too scrupulous away. He was too scrupulous always. She said the sorry. He was too scrupulous always, she said. The duties of the priesthood was too much for him, and then his wife was, you might say, crossed. Yes, said my aunt, he was a disappointed man. You could see that. A silence took possession of the little room, and under cover of it, I approached the table and tested my sherry, and then returned quietly to my chair in the corner. Eliza seemed to have fallen into a deep reverie. We waited respectfully for her to break the silence, and after a long pause, she said slowly, "It was that chalice she broke. That was the beginning of it. Of course, they say it was all right, that it contained nothing. But still, they say it was the boy's fault. But poor James was so nervous. God be merciful to him." "And was that it?" said my aunt. "I heard something." Eliza nodded. "That affected his mind," she said. "After that, he began to move by himself, talking to no one and wandering about by himself. So one night he was wanted for to go on a call, and they couldn't find him anywhere. They looked high up and low down, and still they couldn't see a sight of him anywhere. So then the clerk suggested to try the chapel. So then they got the keys and opened the chapel, and the clerk and Father Oroke and another priest that was there brought in a light for to look for him. And what do you think? But there he was, sitting up by himself in the dark in his confession box, wide awake and laughing like softly to himself. She stopped suddenly as if to listen. I too listened, but there was no sound in the house, and I knew that the old priest was lying still in his coffin as we had seen him, solemn and truculent in death, an idle chalice on his breast. Eliza resumed, wide awake and laughing like to himself. So then, of course, when they saw that, that made them think that there was something gone wrong with him. Thank you. Sorry for the interruptions of noises, and I'm really thankful to you guys to be for being patient and to listen to this short story, and I hope you enjoy it. Let me know in the comment section if you guys have any suggestion for me to read about or any suggestion in my reading technique. And one thing I would like to say is that I have kept the whole reading very natural, like when you sit with your book and you're just reading, and I just want to do that. I don't want to be like too much. Yeah, I have jumbled up sometimes, and that's my mistake. I would try my best not to do those again, but uh, hope you guys are safe, healthy, and happy. Be happy, live your life, enjoy every moment and every second. Thank you again.